astonishment, he referred to it himself. "Julia," said he, "do you observe how I have cut myself in shaving?" "Yes, dear," I replied. "You have cotton wool sticking to your jaw, as if you were growing a white whisker on one side." "It bled a great deal," said he. "I am sorry to hear it." And I mopped up the blood with the new toilet cover. "Never!" I exclaimed. "You haven't been so foolish as to do that." "Yes, and that is just like you. You are much more concerned about your toilet cover being stained than about my poor cheek which is gashed. You were very clumsy to do it," was all I could say. Married people are not always careful to preserve the amenities in private life. It is a pity, but it is so. "It was due to no clumsiness on my part," said he, "though I do allow my nerves have been so shaken broken by married life that I cannot always command my hand, as was the case when I was a bachelor. But this time it was due to that new, stupid, red-haired servant you have introduced into the house without consulting me or my pocket." "Red-haired servant," I echoed. "Yes, that red-haired girl I have seen about. She thrusts herself into my study in a most offensive and objectionable way, but the climax of all was this morning, when I was shaving. I stood in my shirt before the glass, and had lathered my face, and was engaged on my right jaw, when that red-haired girl rushed between me and the mirror with both her elbows up, screening her face with her arms, and her head bowed. I started back, and in so doing cut myself. Where did she come from? How can I tell? I did not expect to see anyone. Then where did she go? I do not know. I was too concerned about my bleeding jaw to look about me. That girl must be dismissed." "I wish she could be dismissed," I said. "What do you mean?" I did not answer my husband, for I really did not know what answer to make. I was now the only person in the house who had not seen the red-haired girl, except possibly the cook, from whom I could gather nothing, but whom I suspected of knowing more concerning this mysterious apparition than she chose to admit. That what had been seen by Bessie and Jane was a supernatural visitant, I now felt convinced, seeing that it had appeared to that least imaginative and most commonplace of all individuals, my husband. By no mental process could he have been got to imagine anything. He certainly did see this red-haired girl, and that no living corporeal maid had been in his dressing room at the time I was perfectly certain. I was soon, however, myself to be included in the number of those before whose eyes she appeared. It was in this wise. Cook had gone out to do some marketing. I was in the breakfast room when, wanting a funnel to fill a little phial of brandy I always keep on the washstand in case of emergencies, I went to the head of the kitchen stairs to descend and fetch what I required. Then I was aware of a great clattering of the fire irons below, and a banging about of the boiler and grate. I went down the steps very hastily and entered the kitchen. There I saw a figure of a short, set girl in a shabby cotton gown, not over clean, and slipshod, stooping before the stove, and striking the fender with the iron poker. She had fiery red hair, very untidy. I uttered an exclamation. Instantly she dropped the poker, and covering her face with her arms, uttering a strange low cry, she dashed round the kitchen table, making nearly the complete circuit, and then swept past me, and I heard her clattering up the kitchen stairs. I was too much taken aback to follow. I stood as one petrified. I felt dazed and unable to trust either my eyes or my ears. Something like a minute must have elapsed before I had sufficiently recovered to turn and leave the kitchen. Then I ascended slowly and, I confess, nervously. I was fearful lest I should find the red-haired girl cowering against the wall and that I should have to pass her, but nothing was to be seen. I reached the hall and saw that no door was open from it except that of the breakfast room. I entered and thoroughly examined every recess, corner, and conceivable hiding place, but could find no one there. Then I ascended the staircase with my hand on the balustrade and searched all the rooms on the first floor without the least success. Above were the servants' apartments, and I now resolved on mounting to them. Here the staircase was uncarpeted. As I was ascending, I heard Jane at work in her room. I then heard her come out hastily upon the landing. At the same moment, with a rush past me, uttering the same moan, went the red-haired girl. I am sure I felt her skirts sweep my dress. I did not notice her till she was close upon me, but I did distinctly see her as she passed. I turned and saw no more. I at once mounted to the landing where was Jane. "What is it?" I asked. "Please, ma'am, I've seen the red-haired girl again, and I did as you recommended. I went at her rattling the pillbox, and she turned and ran downstairs. Did you see her, ma'am, as you came up?" "How inexplicable," I said. I would not admit to Jane that I had seen the apparition. The situation remained unaltered for a week. The mystery was unsolved. No fresh light had been thrown on it. I did not again see or hear anything out of the way, nor did my husband, I presume, for he made no further remarks relative to the extra servant who had caused him so much annoyance. I presume he supposed that I had summarily dismissed her. This I conjectured from a smugness assumed by his face, such as it always acquired when he had carried a point against me, which was not often. However, one evening, abruptly, we had a new sensation. My husband, Bessie, and I were at dinner, and we were partaking of the soup, Jane standing by, waiting to change our plates and to remove the tureen, when we dropped our spoons, alarmed by fearful screams issuing from the kitchen. By the way, characteristically, my husband finished his soup before he laid down the spoon and said, "Good gracious, what is that?" Bessie, Jane, and I were by this time at the door, and we rushed together to the kitchen stairs, and one after the other ran down them. I was the first to enter, and I saw cook wrapped in flames, and a paraffin lamp on the floor broken, and the blazing oil flowing over it. I had sufficient presence of mind to catch up the coconut matting, which was not impregnated with the oil, and to throw it round cook, wrap her tightly in it, and force her down on the floor where not overflowed by the oil. I held her thus, and Bessie succored me. Jane was too frightened to do other than scream. The cries of the burnt woman were terrible. Presently my husband appeared. "Dear me, bless me, good gracious," he said. "You go away and fetch a doctor," I called to him. "You can be of no possible service here, you only get in our way. But the dinner?" "Bother the dinner. Run for a surgeon." In a little while we had removed the poor woman to her room, she shrieking the whole way upstairs, and when there, we laid her on the bed and kept her folded in the coconut matting till a medical man arrived, in spite of her struggles to be free. My husband, on this occasion, acted with commendable promptness, but whether because he was impatient for the completion of his meal, or whether his sluggish nature was for once touched with human sympathy, it is not for me to say. All I know is that so soon as the surgeon was there, I dismissed Jane with, "There, go and get your master the rest of his dinner, and leave us with cook." The poor creature was frightfully burnt. She was attended to devotedly by Bessie and myself, till a nurse was obtained from the hospital. For hours she was as one mad with terror as much as with pain. Next day she was quieter, and sent for me. I hastened to her, and she begged the nurse to leave the room. I took a chair and seated myself by her bedside, and expressed my profound commiseration, and told her that I should like to know how the accident had taken place. "Ma'am, it was the red-haired girl did it." "The red-haired girl?" "Yes, ma'am. I took a lamp to look how the fish was getting on, and all at once I saw her rush straight at me, and I backed, thinking she would knock me down, and the lamp fell over and smashed, and my clothes caught, and, oh, cook! You should not have taken the lamp. It's done, and she would never leave me alone till she had burnt or scalded me. You needn't be afraid. She don't haunt the house. It is me she has haunted, because of what I did to her. Then you know her. She was in service with me, as kitchen maid at my last place near Cambridge. I took a sort of hate against her, she was such a slattern and so inquisitive. She peeped into my letters and turned out my box and drawers. She was ever prying, and when I spoke to her, she was that saucy, I reg'lar hated her. And one day she was kneeling by the stove, and I was there too, and I suppose the devil possessed me, for I upset the boiler, as was on the hot plate, right upon her, just as she looked up, and it poured over her face and bosom and arms, and scalded her that dreadful, she died. And since then she has haunted me. But she'll do so no more. She won't trouble you further. She has done for me, as she has always minded to do since I scalded her to death. The unhappy woman did not recover. "Dear me, no hope?" said my husband, when informed that the surgeon despaired of her. and good cooks are so scarce. By the way, that red-haired girl, gone forever, I said. Chapter 7. A Professional Secret. Mr. Leveridge was in a solicitor's office at Swanton. Mr. Leveridge had been brought up well by a sensible father and an excellent mother. His principles left nothing to be desired. His father was now dead, and his mother did not reside at Swanton, but near her own relations in another part of England. Joseph Leveridge was a mild, inoffensive man, with fair hair and a full head. He was so shy that he did not move in society as he might have done had he been self-assertive, but he was fairly happy, not so happy as he might have been, for reasons to be shortly given. Swanton was a small market town that woke into life every Friday, which was market day, burst into boisterous levity at the Michaelmas fair, and then lapsed back into decorum. It was, except on Fridays, somnolent during the day and asleep at night. Swanton was not a manufacturing town. It possessed one iron foundry and a brewery, so that it afforded little employment for the labouring classes, yet the labouring classes crowded into it, although cottage rents were high, because the farmers could not afford, owing to the hard times, to employ many hands on the land, and because their wives and daughters desired the distractions and dissipations of a town, and supposed that both were to be found in superfluity at Swanton. There was a large town hall with a magistrate's court, where the bench sat every month once. The church, in the centre of the town, was an imposing structure of stone, very cold within. The presentation was in the hands of the Simeonite trustees, so that the vicar was of the theological school, if that can be called a school where nothing is taught called evangelical. The services ever long and dismal. The vicar slowly and impressively declaimed the prayers, preached lengthy sermons, and condemned the congregation to sing out of the mitre hymnal. The principal solicitor, Mr. Stork, was clerk of the petty sessions and registrar. He did a limited amount of legal work for the landed gentry round, was trustee to some widows and orphans, and was consulted by tottering yeomen as to their financial difficulties, lent them some money to relieve their immediate embarrassments, on the security of their land, which ultimately passed into his possession. To this gentleman, Mr. Leveridge had been articled. He had been induced to adopt the legal profession, not from any true vocation, but at the instigation of his mother, who had urged him to follow in the professional footsteps of his revered father. But the occupation was not one that accorded with the tastes of the young man, who, notwithstanding his apparent mildness and softness, was not deficient in brains. He was a shrewd observer, and was endowed with a redundant imagination. From a child he had scribbled stories, and with his pencil had illustrated them. But this had brought upon him severe rebukes from his mother, who looked with disfavour on works of imagination, and his father had taken him across his knee, of course, before he was adult, and had castigated him with the flat of the hairbrush for surreptitiously reading the Arabian Nights. Mr. Leveridge's days passed evenly enough. There was some business coming into the office on Fridays, and none at all on Sundays, on which day he wrote a long and affectionate letter to his widowed mother. He would have been a happy man, happy in a mild, lotus-eating way, but for three things. In the first place, he became conscious that he was not working in his proper vocation. He took no pleasure in engrossing deeds, indentures his soul abhorred. He knew himself to be capable of better things, and feared lest the higher faculties of his mind should become atrophied by lack of exercise. In the second place, he was not satisfied that his superior was a man of strict integrity. He had no reason whatever for supposing that anything dishonest went on in the office, but he had discovered that his boss was a daring and venturesome speculator, and he feared lest temptation should induce him to speculate with the funds of those to whom he acted as trustee. And Joseph, with his high sense of rectitude, was apprehensive lest some day something might there be done, which would cause a crash. Lastly, Joseph Leveridge had lost his heart. He was consumed by a hopeless passion for Miss Asphodel Vincent, a young lady with a small fortune of about £400 per annum, to whom Mr. Stork was guardian and trustee. This young lady was tall, slender, willowy, had a sweet, Madonna-like face, and like Joseph himself was constitutionally shy, and she was unconscious of her personal and pecuniary attractions. She moved in the best society. She was taken up by the county people. No doubt she would be secured by the son of some squire, and settle down as Lady Bountiful in some parish, or else some wily curate with a moustache would step in and carry her off. But her bashfulness and her indifference to men's society had so far protected her. She loved her garden, cultivated herbaceous plants, and was specially addicted to a rockery in which she acclimatized flowers from the Alps. As Mr. Stork was her guardian, she often visited the office when Joseph flew with heightened colour to offer her a chair till Mr. Stork was disengaged, but conversation between them had never passed beyond generalities. Mr. Leveridge occasionally met her in his country walks, but never advanced in intimacy beyond raising his hat and remarking on the weather. Probably it was the stimulus of this devouring and despairing passion which drove Mr. Leveridge to writing a novel, in which he could paint Asphodel under another name in all her perfections. She should move through his story diffusing an atmosphere of sweetness and saintliness, but he could not bring himself to provide her with a lover, and to conclude his romance with her union to a being of the male sex. Impressed as he had been in early youth by the admonitions of his mother, and the applications of the hairbrush by his father, that the imagination was a dangerous and elusive gift, to be restrained, not indulged, he resolved that he would create no characters for his story, but make direct studies from life. Consequently, when the work was completed, it presented the most close portraits of a certain number of the residents in Swanton, and the town in which the scene was laid was very much like Swanton, though he called it Busbury. But to find a publisher was a more difficult work than to write the novel. Mr. Leveridge sent his Ms. typewritten to several firms, and it was declined by one after another. At last, however, it fell into the hands of an unusually discerning reader, who saw in it distinct tokens of ability. It was not one to appeal to the general public. It contained no blood-curdling episodes, no hairbreadth escapes, no risky situations. It was simply a transcript of life in a little English country town. Though not high-spiced to suit the vulgar taste, still the reader and the publisher considered that there was a discerning public, small and select, that relished good, honest work of the Jane Austen kind, and the latter resolved on risking the production. Accordingly, he offered the author £50 for the work, he buying all rights. Joseph Leveridge was overwhelmed at the munificence of the offer, and accepted it gratefully and with alacrity. The next stage in the proceedings consisted in the revision of the proofs, and who that has not experienced it can judge of the sensation of exquisite delight afforded by this to the young author. After the correction of his romance, if romance such a prosaic tale can be called in print, with characteristic modesty Leveridge insisted that his story should appear under an assumed name. What the name adopted was it does not concern the reader of this narrative to know. Some time now elapsed before the book appeared, at the usual publishing time in October. Eventually it came out, and Mr. Leveridge received his 6 copies, neatly and quietly bound in cloth. He cut and read one with avidity, and at once perceived that he had overlooked several typographical errors, and wrote to the publisher to beg that these might be corrected in the event of a second edition being called for. On the morning following the publication and dissemination of the book, Joseph Leveridge lay in bed a little longer than usual, smiling in happy self-gratification at the thought that he had become an author. On the table by his bed stood his extinguished candle, his watch, and the book. He had looked at it the last thing before he closed his eyes in sleep. It was moreover the first thing that his eyes rested on when they opened. A fond mother could not have gazed on her newborn babe with greater pride and affection. Whilst he thus lay and said to himself, I positively must get up and dress," he heard a stumping on the stairs, and a few moments later his door was burst open, and in came Major Dolgelly Jones, a retired officer, resident in Swanton, who had never before done him the honour of a call, and now he actually penetrated to Joseph's bedroom. The Major was hot in the face. He panted for breath. His cheeks quivered. The Major was a man who, judging by what could be perceived of his intellectual gifts, could not have been a great acquisition to the army. He was a man who never could have been trusted to act a brilliant part. He was a creature of routine a martinet, and since his retirement to Swanton had been a passionate golf player and nothing else. "What do you mean, sir? What do you mean?" spluttered he. "By putting me into your book?" "My book?" echoed Joseph, affecting surprise. "What book do you refer to?" "Oh, it's all very well your assuming that air of injured innocence. You're trying to evade my question. Your sheepish expression does not deceive me. Why, there is the book in question by your bedside. I have, I admit, been reading that novel, which has recently appeared. You wrote it. Everyone in Swanton knows it. I don't object to your writing a book. Any fool can do that, especially a novel. What I do object to is your putting me into it." "If I remember rightly," said Joseph, quaking under the bedclothes and then wiping his upper lip on which a dew was forming, "if I remember aright, there is in it a major who plays golf and does nothing else, but his name is Piper. What do I care about a name? It is I you have put me in. Really, Major Jones, you have no justification in thus accusing me. The book does not bear my name on the back and title page. Neither does the golfing retired military officer bear my name, but that does not matter. It is I myself. I am in your book. I would horsewhip you had I any energy left in me, but all is gone. Gone with my personality into your book. Nothing is left of me. Nothing but a body in a light tweed suit. I've been taken out of myself and transferred to that," he used a naughty word, "that book. How can I golf any more? Walk the links any more with any heart? How can I putt a ball and follow it up with any feeling of interest? I am but a carcass. My soul, my character, my individuality have been burgled. You have broken into my inside and have despoiled me of my personality," and he began to cry. "Possibly," suggested Mr. Leveridge, "the author can do nothing. I have been robbed, my fine ethereal self has been purloined. I, Dolgelly Jones, am only an outside husk. You have despoiled me of my richest jewel myself. I really can do nothing, Major. I know you can do nothing, that is the pity of it. You have sucked all my spiritual being with its concomitants out of me, and cannot put it back again. You have used me up." Then, wringing his hands, the Major left the room, stumped slowly downstairs and quitted the house. Joseph Leveridge rose from his bed and dressed in great perturbation of mind. Here was a condition of affairs on which he had not reckoned. He was so distracted in mind that he forgot to brush his teeth. When he reached his little sitting room, he found that the table was laid for his breakfast, and that his landlady had just brought up the usual rashers of bacon and 2 boiled eggs. She was sobbing. "What is the matter, Mrs. Baker?" asked Joseph. "Has Licinia," that was the name of the servant, "broken any more dishes?" "Everything has happened," replied the woman. "You have taken away my character." I never did such a thing." "Oh, yes, sir, you have. All the time you've been writing, I've felt it going out of me like perspiration. And now, it is all in your book." "My book?" "Yes, sir, under the name of Mrs. Brooks. But law, sir, what is there in a name? You might have taken the name of Baker and used that as you likes. There be plenty of Bakers in England and the colonies. But it's my character, sir, you've taken away and shoved it into your book." Then the woman wiped her eyes with her apron. "But really, Mrs. Baker, if there be a landlady in this novel of which you complain, there is, and it is me. But it is a mere work of fiction." "It is not a work of fiction. It is a work of fact, and that a cruel fact. What has a poor lorn widow like me got to boast of but her character? I'm sure I've done well by you, and never boiled your eggs hard, and to use me like this. Good gracious, dear Mrs. Baker. Don't dear me, sir. If you had loved me, if you had been decently grateful for all I have done for you and mended your socks too, you'd not have stolen my character from me and put it into your book. Ah, sir, you have dealt by me what I call regular shameful, and not like a gentleman. You have used me up." Joseph was silent, cowed. He turned the rashers about on the dish with his fork in an abstracted manner. All desire to eat was gone from him. Then the landlady went on, "And it's not me only as has to complain. There are 3 gentlemen outside, sitting on the doorstep, awaiting of you, and they say that there they will remain till you go out to your office, and they intend to have it out with you." Joseph started from the chair he had taken and went to the window and threw up the sash. Leaning out, he saw 3 hats below. It was as Mrs. Baker had intimated. 3 gentlemen were seated on the doorstep. One was the vicar, another his boss, Mr. Stork, and the third was Mr. Wotherspoon. There could be no mistake about the vicar. He wore a chimney-pot hat of silk that had begun to curl at the brim, anticipatory of being adapted as that of an archdeacon. Moreover, he wore extensive, well-cultivated grey whiskers on each cheek. If we were inclined to adopt the modern careless usage, we might say that he grew whiskers on either cheek. But in strict accuracy, that would mean that the whiskers grew indifferently, or alternatively, intermittently on one cheek or the other. This, however, was not the case. Consequently, we say on each cheek. These whiskers now waved and fluttered in the light air passing up and down the street. The second was Mr. Stork. He wore a stiff felt hat. His fiery hair showed beneath it, behind, and in front. When he lifted his head, the end of his pointed nose showed distinctly to Joseph Leveridge, who looked down from above. The third, Mr. Wotherspoon, had a crushed brown cap on. He sat with his hands between his knees, dejected, and looking on the ground. Mr. Wotherspoon lived in Swanton with his mother and 3 sisters. The mother was the widow of an officer, not well off. He was an agreeable man, an excellent player at lawn tennis, croquet, golf, rackets, billiards, and cards. His age was 30, and he had as yet no occupation. His mother gently, his sisters sharply, urged him to do something, so as to earn his livelihood. With his mother's death, her pension would cease, and he could not then depend on his sisters. He always answered that something would turn up. Occasionally he ran to town to look for employment, but invariably returned without having secured any, and with his pockets empty. He was so cheerful, so good-natured, was such good company, that everyone liked him, but also everyone was provoked at his sponging on his mother and sisters. "Really," said Mr. Leveridge, "I cannot encounter those 3. It is true that I have drawn them pretty accurately in my novel, and here they are ready to take me to account for so doing. I will leave the house by the back door." Without his breakfast, Joseph fled, and having escaped from those who had hoped to intercept him, he made his way to the river. Here were pleasant grounds, with walks laid out, and benches provided. The place was not likely to be frequented at that time of the morning, and Mr. Leveridge had half an hour to spare before he was due at the office. There, later, he was likely to meet his boss, but it was better to face him alone than him accompanied by 2 others who had a similar grievance against him. He seated himself on a bench and thought. He did not smoke. He had promised his mamma not to do so, and he was a dutiful son, and regarded his undertaking. What should he do? He was becoming involved in serious embarrassments. Would it be possible to induce the publisher to withdraw the book from circulation and to receive back the £50? That was hardly possible. He had signed away all his rights in the novel, and the publisher had been to a considerable expense for paper, printing, binding, and advertising. He was roused from his troubled thoughts by seeing Miss Asphodel Vincent coming along the walk towards him. Her step had lost its wonted spring, her carriage its usual buoyancy. In a minute or 2 she would reach him. Would she deign to speak? He felt no compunction towards her. He had made her his heroine in the tale. By not a word had he cast a shadow over her character or her abilities. Indeed, he had pictured her as the highest ideal of an English girl. She might be flattered, she could not be offended. And yet there was no flattery in his pencil. He had sketched her in as she was. As she approached, she noticed the young author. She did not hasten her step. She displayed a strange listlessness in her movements, and lack of vivacity in her eye. When she stood over against him, Joseph Leveridge rose and removed his hat. "An early promenade, Miss Vincent," he said. "Oh," she said, "I am glad to meet you here where we cannot be overheard. I have something about which I must speak to you, to complain of a great injury done to me." "You do me a high honor," exclaimed Joseph. "If I can do anything to alleviate your distress and to redress the wrong, command me." "You can do nothing. It is impossible to undo what has already been done. You put me into your book. Miss Vincent, protested Leverage with vehemence. "If I have, what then? I have not in the least overcharged the colours by a line caricatured you. It was in vain for him further to pretend not to be the author and to have merely read the book. That may be, or it may not, but you have taken strange liberties with me in transferring me to your pages, and you really recognized yourself. It is myself, my very self, who is there, and yet you are here, before my humble self. That is only my outer shell. All my individuality, all that goes to make up the ego I myself has been taken from me and put into your book. Surely that cannot be. But it is so. I feel precisely as I suppose felt my doll when I was a child, when it became unstitched and all the bran ran out. It hung limp like a rag. But it is not bran you have deprived me of. It is my personality. In my novel is your portraiture indeed, but you yourself are here, said Leverage. It is my very self, my noblest and best part, my moral and intellectual self, which has been carried off and put into your book. This is quite impossible, Miss Vincent. A moment's thought, said she, will convince you that it is as I say. If I pick an alpine flower and transfer it to my blotting book, it remains in the herbarium. It is no longer on the Alp where it bloomed. But, urged Joseph. No, she interrupted. You cannot undeceive me. No one can be in two places at the same time. If I am in your book, I cannot be here, except so far as goes my animal nature and frame. You have subjected me, Mr. Leverage, to the greatest humiliation. I am by you reduced to the level of a score of girls that I know, with no pursuits, no fixed principles, no opinions of their own, no ideas. They are swayed by every fashion. They are moulded by their surroundings. They are destitute of what some would call moral fibre, and I would term character. I had all this, but you have deprived me of it by putting it into your book. I shall henceforth be the sport of every breath, be influenced by every folly, be without self-confidence and decision, the prey to any adventurer. For heaven's sake, do not say that. I cannot say anything other. If I had a sovereign in my purse and a pickpocket stole it, I should no longer have the purse and sovereign, only the pocket. And I am a mere pocket now without the coin of my personality that you have filched from me. Mr. Leverage, it was a cruel wrong you did me when you used me up then. Sighing, Miss Asphodel went languidly on her way. Joseph was as one stunned. He buried his face in his hands. The person of all others with whom he desired to stand well, that person looked upon him as her most deadly enemy, at all events as the one who had most cruelly aggrieved her. Presently, hearing the clock strike, he started. He was due at the office, and Joseph Leverage had always made a point of punctuality. He now went to the office and learned from his fellow clerk that Mr. Stork had not returned. He had been there, and then had gone away to seek Leverage at his lodgings. Joseph considered it incumbent on him to resume his hat and go in quest of his boss. On his way it occurred to him that there was monotony in bacon and eggs for breakfast every morning, and he would like a change. Moreover, he was hungry. He had left the house of Mrs. Baker without taking a mouthful, and if he returned now for a snack, the eggs and the bacon would be cold. So he stepped into the shop of Mr. Box, the grocer, for a tin of sardines in oil. When the grocer saw him, he said, "Will you favour me with a word, sir, in the back shop?" "I am pressed for time," replied Leverage nervously. "But one word, I will not detain you," said Mr. Box, and led the way. Joseph walked after him. "Sir," said the grocer, shutting the glass door, "you have done me a prodigious wrong. You have deprived me of what I would not have lost for £1,000. You have put me into your book. How my business will get on without me, I mean my intellect, my powers of organization, my trade instincts, in a word, myself, I do not know. You have taken them from me and put them into your book. I am consigned to a novel, when I want all my powers behind the counter. Possibly my affairs for a while will go on by the weight of their own momentum, but it cannot be for long without my controlling brain. Sir, you have brought me and my family to ruin. You have used me up." Leverage could bear this no more. He seized the handle of the door, rushed through the outer shop, precipitated himself into the street, carrying the sardine tin in his hand, and hurried to his lodgings. But there new trouble awaited him. On the doorstep still sat the three gentlemen. When they saw him, they rose to their feet. I know what you have to say," gasped Joseph. "In pity, do not attack me altogether. One at a time. With your leave, Mr. Vicar, will you step up first into my humble little sanctum, and I will receive the others later. I believe that the smell of bacon and eggs is gone from the room." I left the window open. "I will most certainly follow you," said the Vicar of Swanton. "This is a most serious matter." "Excuse me, will you take a chair?" "No, thank you. I can speak best when on my legs. I lose impressiveness when seated. But I fear, alas, that gift has been taken from me." Sir, you have put me into your book. My earthly tabernacle may be here, standing on your, or Mrs. Baker's drugget, but all my great oratorical powers have gone. I have been despoiled of what was in me my highest, noblest, most spiritual parts. What my preaching henceforth will be, I fear to contemplate. I may be able to string together a number of texts and tack on an application, but that is mere mechanical work. I used to dredge in much florid eloquence, to stick in the flowers of elocution between every joint, and now I am despoiled of all. I, the Vicar of Swanton, shall be as a mere stick. I shall no more be a power in the pulpit, a force on the platform. My prospects in the diocese are put an end to. Miserable, miserable young man. You might have pumped others, but why me? I know but too surely that you have used me up." The vicar had taken off his hat. His bald forehead was beaded. His bristling grey whiskers drooped. His unctuous expression had faded away. His eyes, usually bearing the look as though turned inward in ecstatic contemplation of his personal piety, with only a watery stare on the world without, were now dull. He turned to the door. "I will send up Stork," he said. "Do so by all means, sir," was all that Joseph could say. When the solicitor entered, his red hair had assumed a darker dye through the moisture that exuded from his head. "Mr. Leveridge," said he, "this is a scurvy trick you have played me. You have put me into your book." "I only sketched a not over-scrupulous lawyer," protested Joseph. "Why should you put the cap on your own head?" "Because it fits." "It is myself you have put into your book, and by no legal process can I get out of it. I shall not be competent to advise the magistrates on the bench, and, good heavens, what a mess they will get into. I do not know whether your fellow clerk can carry on the business. I have been used up. I'll tell you what, you go away. I want you no more at the office. Whenever you revisit Swanton, you will see only the ruins of the respected firm of Stork. It cannot go on when I am not in it, but in your book." The last to arrive was Mr. Wotherspoon. He was in a most depressed condition. "There was not much in me," said he, "not at any time. You might have spared such a trifle as me, and not put me also into your book and used me up. Oh dear, dear, what will my poor mother do, and how Sarah and Jane will bully me." That same day Mr. Leveridge packed up his traps and departed from Swanton for his mother's house. That she was delighted to see him need not be said. That something was wrong, her maternal instinct told her. But it was not for some days that he confided to her so much as this: "Oh, mother, I have written a novel, and have put into it the people of Swanton, and so have had to leave." "My dear Joe," said the old lady, "you have done wrong and made a great mistake. You never should introduce actual living personages into a work of fiction. You should pulp them first and then run out your characters fresh from the pulp." "I was so afraid of using my imagination," explained Joe. Some months elapsed, and Leveridge could not resolve on an employment that would suit him and at the same time maintain him. The £50 he had earned would not last long. He began to be sensible of the impulse to be again writing. He resisted it for a while, but when he got a letter from his publisher, saying that the novel had sold well, far better than had been expected, and that he would be pleased to consider another from Mr. Leveridge's pen, and could promise him for it more liberal terms, then Joseph's scruples vanished. But on one thing he was resolved. He would now create his characters. They should not be taken from observation. Moreover, he determined to differentiate his new work from the old in other material points. His characters should be the reverse of those in the first novel. For his heroine, he imagined a girl of boisterous spirits, straightforward, true, but somewhat unconventional, and given to use slang expressions. He had never met with such a girl, so that she would be a pure creation of his brain, and he made up his mind to call her Poppy. Then he would avoid drawing the portrait of an evangelical parson, and introduce one decidedly high church. He would have no heavy, narrow tradesman like Box, but a man full of venture and speculative push. Moreover, having used up the not over-scrupulous lawyer, he would portray one, the soul of honour, the confidant of not only the county gentry, but of the county nobility. And as he had caused so much trouble by the introduction of good old Mother Baker, he would trace the line of a lively, skittish young widow, always on the hunt after admirers, and endeavouring to entangle the youths who lodged with her. As he went on with his story, it worked out to his satisfaction, and what especially gratified him and gave repose to his mind was the consciousness that he was using no one up with whom he was acquainted, and that all his characters were pure creations. The work was complete, and the publisher agreed to give £100 for it. Then it passed through the press, and in due course Leverage heard from the publisher that his 6 free copies had been sent off to him by train. Joseph was almost as excited over his second novel as he was over the first. He was too impatient to wait till the parcels were sent round in the ordinary way. He hurried to the station in the evening to meet the train from town, by which he expected his consignment, and having secured it, he hurried home, carrying the heavy parcel. His mother's house was comparatively large. She occupied but a corner of it, and she had given over to her son a little cosy sitting room, in which he might write and read. Into this room Joseph carried his parcel, full of impatience to cut the string and disclose the volumes. But he had hardly passed through his door before he was startled to see that his room was full of people. All but one was seated about the table. That one who was not lounged against the bookcase, standing on one foot. With a shock of surprise, Joseph recognized all those there gathered together. They were the characters in his book, his own creations. And that individual who stood in an indifferent attitude was his new heroine, Poppy. The first shock of surprise rapidly passed. Joseph Leverage felt no fear, but rather a sense of pleasure. He was in the presence of his own creations, and knew them familiarly. There were 7 in all. At his appearance they all saluted him respectfully as their creator all, except Poppy, who gave him a wink and a nod. At the head of the table sat the high church parson, shaven, with a long coat and a grave face. Next to him, on the right, Lady Mabel Forraby, a tall, elderly, aristocratic-looking woman, the aunt of Poppy. One element of lightness in the book had consisted in the struggles of Lady Mabel to control her wayward niece and the revolt of the latter. Mr. Leverage had never known a person of title in his life, so that Lady Mabel was a pure creation, so also brought up as he had been by a Calvinistic mother, and afterwards thrown under the ministry of the Vicar of Swanton. He had not once come across a ritualist. Consequently, his parson in this instance was also a pure creation. A young gentleman, the hero of the novel, a bright, intelligent fellow, full of vigour and good sense, and highly cultured, sat next to Lady Mabel. Joseph had never been thrown into association with men of quite this type. He had met nice, respectable clerks and amusing and agreeable travellers for commercial houses, so that this personage also was a creation. So most certainly was the bold, pert little widow who rolled her eyes and put on winsome airs. Joseph had kept clear of all such instances, but he had heard and read of them. She could look to him as her creator. And that naughty little Poppy. Her naughtiness was all mischief, put on to aggravate her staid old aunt, so full of daring, and yet withal so steady of heart, so full of frolic, but with principle underlying it all. Joseph had never encountered anyone like her, anyone approaching to her. The young ladies to whom his mother introduced him were all very prim and proper. At Swanton he had been little in society. The vicar's daughter was a tract distributor and a mission woman, and Mr. Stork's daughter a domestic drudge. Of all the characters in Joseph's book, she was his most especial and delightful creation. Then the white-haired family lawyer, fond of his jokes, able to tell a good story, close as a walnut relative to all matters communicated to him, strict and honourable in all his dealings, content with his small earnings and frugally laying them by. Joseph had not met such a man, but he had idealized him as the sort of lawyer he would wish to be should he stick to his profession. He also, accordingly, was a creation. And last, but not least, was the red-faced, audacious stockbroker, a man of sharp and quick determination, who saw a chance in a moment and closed on it, who was keen of scent and smelt a risky investment the moment it came before him. Joseph knew no stockbroker, had only heard of them by rumor. He therefore was a creation. "Well, my children, not of my loins, but of my brain," said the author. "What do you all want?" "Bodies," they replied with one voice. "Bodies," gasped Joseph, stepping backwards. "Why, what possesses you all? You can't expect me to furnish you with them." "But indeed we do, old chap," said Poppy. "Niece," said Lady Mabel, turning about in her chair, "address your creator with more respect." "Stay, my lady," said the parson. "Allow me to explain matters to Mr. Leveridge. He is young and an inexperienced writer of fiction, and is therefore unaware of the exigencies of his profession. You must know, dear author of our being, that every author of a work of imagination, such as you have been, lays himself under a moral and an inexorable obligation to find bodies for all those whom he has called into existence through his fertile brain. Mr. Leveridge has not mixed in the literary world. He does not belong to the Society of Authors. He will excuse the expression, raw in his profession. It is a well-known law among novelists that they must furnish bodies for such as they have called into existence out of their pure imagination. For this reason they invariably call their observation to their assistance, and they balance in their books the creations with the transcripts from life. The only exception to this rule that I am aware of, continued the parson, is where the author is able to get his piece dramatized, in which case, of course, the difficulty ceases. I should love to go on the stage, threw in Poppy. "Niece, you do not know what you say," remarked Lady Mabel, turning herself about. "Allow me, my lady," said the parson. "What I have said is fact, is it not?" "Most certainly," replied all. Lady Mabel said, "I suppose it is." "Then," pursued the parson, "the situation is this. Have you secured the dramatization of your novel?" "I never gave it a thought," said Joseph. "In that case, as there is no prospect of our being so accommodated, the position is this. We shall have to haunt you night and day, mainly at night. Till you have accommodated us with bodies, we cannot remain as phantom creations of a highly imaginative soul such as is yours, Mr. Leveridge. If you have your rights, so have we, and we insist on ours, and will insist till we are satisfied." At once, all vanished. Joseph Leveridge felt that he had got himself into a worse hobble than before. From his former difficulties he had escaped by flight. But there was, he feared, no flying from these 7 impatient creations all clamouring for bodies, and to provide them with such was beyond his powers. All his delight in the publication of his new novel was spent. It had brought with it care and perplexity. He went to bed. During the night he was troubled with his characters. They peeped in at him. Poppy got a peacock's feather and tickled his nose just as he was dropping asleep. "You bounder," she said. "I shall give you no peace till you have settled me into a body. But oh, get me onto the stage if you can." "Poppy, come away," called Lady Mabel. "Don't be improper. Mr. Leveridge will do his best. I want a body quite as much as do you, but I know how to ask for it properly." "And I," said the parson, "should like to have mine before Easter, but have one I must." Mr. Leveridge's state now was worse than the first. One or other of his creatures was ever watching him. His every movement was spied on. There was no escaping their vigilance. Sometimes they attended him in groups of 2 or 3. Sometimes they were all around him. At meals not one was missing, and they eyed every mouthful of his food as he raised it to his lips. His mother saw nothing. The creations were invisible to all eyes save those of their creator. If he went out for a country walk, they trotted forth with him, some before, looking round at every turn to see which way he purposed going, some following. Poppy and the skittish widow managed to attach themselves to him, one on each side. "I hate that little woman," said Poppy. "Why did you call her into being?" Some before, some following. I never dreamed that things would come to this pass. I am convinced, Creator dear, that there is a vein of wickedness in your composition, or you would never have imagined such a minx, good and amiable, and butter won't melt in your mouth, though you may look. And there must be a frolicsome devil in your heart, or I should never have become. Indeed, Poppy, I am very glad that I gave you being, but one may have too much even of a good thing, and there are moments when I could dispense with your presence. I know when you want to carry on with the widow, she is always casting sheep's eyes at you. But, Poppy, you forget my hero, whom I created on purpose for you. All my attention is now engrossed in you, and will be till you provide me with a body. When Leverage was in his room reading, if he raised his eyes from his book, they met the stare of one of his characters. If he went up to his bedroom, he was followed. If he sat with his mother, one kept guard. This was become so intolerable that one evening he protested to the stockbroker, who was then in attendance, "Do, I entreat you, leave me to myself. You treat me as if I were a lunatic and about to commit felo de se, and you were my warders." "We watch you, sir," said the stockbroker, "in our own interest. We cannot suffer you to give us the slip. We are all expectant and impatient for the completion of what you have begun." Then the parson undertook to administer a lecture on duty, on responsibilities contracted to those called into partial existence by a writer of fiction. He cannot be allowed to half do his work. His creations must be realized, and can only be realized by being given a material existence. But what the dickens can I do? I cannot fabricate bodies for you. I never in my life even made a doll. Have you no thought of dramatizing us? I know no dramatic writers. Do it yourself. Does not this sort of work require a certain familiarity with the technique of the stage which I do not possess? That might be attended to later. Pass your mise through the hands of a dramatic expert, and pay him a percentage of your profits in recognition of his services. Only one thing I bargain for. Do not present me on the stage in such a manner as to discredit my cloth. Have I done so in my book? No, indeed, I have nothing to complain of in that. But there is no counting on what Poppy may persuade you into doing, and I fear that she is gaining influence over you. Remember, she is your creation, and you must not suffer her to mold you. The idea took root. The suggestion was taken up, and Joseph Leverage applied himself to his task with zest. But he had to conceal what he was about from his mother, who had no opinion of the drama, and regarded the theatre as a sink of iniquity. But now new difficulties arose. Joseph's creations would not leave him alone for a moment. Each had a suggestion. Each wanted his or her own part accentuated at the expense of the other. Each desired the heightening of the situations in which they severally appeared. The clamour, the bickering, the interference made it impossible for Joseph to collect his thoughts, keep cool, and proceed with his work. Sunday arrived, and Joseph drew on his gloves, put on his box hat, and offered his arm to his mother, to conduct her to chapel. All the characters were drawn up in the hall to accompany them. Joseph and his mother, walking down the street to Ebenezer Chapel, presented a picture of a good and dutiful son, and of a pious widow not to be surpassed. Poppy and the widow entered into a struggle as to which was to walk on the unoccupied side of Joseph. If this had been introduced into the picture, it would have marred it, but happily this was invisible to all eyes save those of Joseph. The rest of the imaginary party walked arm in arm behind till the chapel was reached, when the parson started back. "I am not going in there. It is a schism shop," he exclaimed. "Nothing in the world would induce me to cross the threshold." "And I," said Lady Mabel, "I have no idea of attending a place of worship not of the established church." "I'll go in, if only to protect Creator from the widow," said Poppy. Joseph and his mother entered and occupied their pew. The characters, with the exception of the parson and the old lady, grouped themselves where they were able. The stockbroker stood in the aisle with his arms on the pew door to ensure that Joseph was kept a prisoner there. But before the service had advanced far, he had gone to sleep. This was the more to be regretted, as the minister delivered a very strong appeal to the unconverted, and if ever there was an unconverted worldling, it was that stockbroker. The skittish widow was leering at a deacon of an amorous complexion, but as he did not, and in fact could not see her, all her efforts were cast away. The solicitor sat with stolid face and folded hands, and allowed the discourse to flow over him like a refreshing douche. Poppy had got very tired of the show, and had slunk away to rejoin her aunt. The hero closed his eyes and seemed resigned. After nearly an hour had elapsed whilst a hymn was being sung, Joseph, more to himself than to his mother, said, "Can I escape?" "Escape what, wretch?" inquired the widowed lady. "I think I can do it. There's a room at the side for earnest inquirers, or a vestry or something with an outer door. I will risk it, and make a bolt for my liberty." He very gently and cautiously unhasped the door of the pew, and as he slid it open, the sleeping stockbroker, still sleeping and unconscious, slipped back, and Joseph was out. He made his way into the room at the side, forth from the actual chapel, ran through it, and tried the door that opened into a side lane. It was locked, but happily the key was in its place. He turned it, plunged forth, and fell into the arms of his characters. They were all there. The solicitor had been observing him out of the corner of his eye, and had given the alarm. The stockbroker was aroused, and he, the solicitor, the hero, ran out, gave the alarm to the three without, and Joseph was intercepted, and his attempt at escape frustrated. He was reconducted home by them, himself dejected, they triumphant. When his mother returned, she was full of solicitude. "What was the matter, Joe dear?" she inquired. "I wasn't feeling very well," he explained, "but I shall be better presently. I hope it will not interfere with your appetite, Joe. I have cold lamb and mint sauce for our early dinner." "I shall peck a bit, I trust," said Mr. Leveridge. But during dinner he was abstracted and silent. All at once he brought down his fist on the table. "I've hit it," he exclaimed, and a flush of colour mantled his face to the temples. "My dear," said his mother, "you have made all the plates and dishes jump, and have nearly upset the water bottle. Excuse me, mother, I really must go to my room." He rose, made a sign to his characters, and they all rose and trooped after him into his private apartment. When they were within, he said to his hero, "May I trouble you kindly to shut the door and turn the key? My mother will be anxious and come after me, and I want a word with you all. It will not take 2 minutes. I see my way to our mutual accommodation. Do not be uneasy and suspicious. I will make no further attempt at evasion. Meet me tomorrow morning at the down train. I am going to take you all with me to Swanton." A tap at the door. "Open, it is my mother," said Joseph. Mrs. Leveridge entered with a face of concern. "What is the matter with you, Joe?" she said. "If we were not both of us water drinkers, I should say that you had been indulging in spirits." "Mother, I must positively be off to Swanton tomorrow morning. I see my way now. All will come right." "How, my precious boy?" "I cannot explain. I see my way to clearing up the unpleasantness caused by that unfortunate novel of mine. Pack my trunk, mother." "Not on the Sabbath, lovey." "No, tomorrow morning. I start by the 9:48 a.m. We all go together." Am I to accompany you?" No, did I say? It is a habit I have got into as an author. Authors, like royal personages, speak of themselves as we." Joseph Leveridge was occupied during the afternoon in writing to his victims at Swanton. First, he penned a notice to Mrs. Baker that he would require his lodgings from the morrow, and that he had something to say to her that would afford her much gratification. Then he wrote to the vicar, expressed his regret for having deprived him of his personality, and requested him, if he would do him the favour, to call in the evening at 7.30 at his lodgings in West Street. He had something of special importance to communicate to him. He apologised for not himself calling at the vicarage, but said that there were circumstances that made it more desirable that he should see his reverence privately in his own lodgings. Next he addressed an epistle to Mr. Stork. He assured him that he, Joseph Leveridge, had felt keenly the wrong he had done him, that he had forfeited his esteem, had ill repaid his kindness, had acted in a manner towards his employer that was dishonourable. But, he added, he had found a means of rectifying what was wrong. He placed himself unreservedly in the hands of Mr. Stork, and entreated him to meet him at his rooms in West Street on the ensuing Monday evening at 7:45, when he sincerely trusted that the past would be forgotten and a brighter future would be assured. This was followed by a formal letter couched to Mr. Box. He invited him to call at Mrs. Baker's lodgings on that same evening at 8 p.m., as he had business of an important and far-reaching nature to discuss with him. If Mr. Box considered that he, Joseph Leveridge, had done him an injury, he was ready to make what reparation lay in his power. Taking a fresh sheet of notepaper, he now wrote a fifth letter, this to Mr. Wotherspoon, requesting the honour of a call at his diggings at 8:15 p.m., when matters of controversy between them could be amicably adjusted. The ensuing letter demanded some deliberation. It was to Asphodel. He wrote it out twice before he was satisfied with the mode in which it was expressed. He endeavoured to disguise under words full of respect, yet not disguise too completely, the sentiments of his heart. But he was careful to let drop nothing at which she might take umbrage. He entreated her to be so gracious as to allow him an interview by the side of the river at the hour of. On the Monday evening, he apologized for venturing to make such a demand, but he intimated that the matter he had to communicate was so important and so urgent that it could not well be postponed till Tuesday, and that it was also most necessary that the interview should be private. It was something he had to say that would materially, no, not materially, but morally affect her, and would relieve his mind from a burden of remorse that had become to him wholly intolerable. The final, the seventh letter, was to Major Dolgelly Jones, and was more brief. It merely intimated that he had something of the utmost importance to communicate to his private ear, and for this purpose he desired the favour of a call at Mrs. Baker's lodgings at 8:45 on Monday evening. These letters dispatched, Mr. Leveridge felt easier in mind and lighter at heart. He slept well the ensuing night, better than he had for long. His creations did not so greatly disturb him. He was aware that he was still kept under surveillance, but the watch was not so strict, nor so galling as hitherto. On the Monday morning he was at the station, and took his ticket for Swanton. One ticket sufficed, as his companions who awaited him on the platform were imaginary characters. When he took his seat, they pressed into the carriage after him. Poppy secured the seat next him, but the widow placed herself opposite and exerted all her blandishment with the hope of engrossing his whole attention. At a junction all got out, and Joseph provided himself with a luncheon basket and mineral water. The characters watched him discussing the half-chicken and slabs of ham with the liveliest interest, and were especially observant of his treatment of the thin paper napkin wherewith he wiped his fingers and mouth. At last he arrived at Swanton and engaged a cab, as he was encumbered with a portmanteau. Lady Mabel, Poppy, and the widow could be easily accommodated within, the two latter with their backs to the horses. Joseph would willingly have resigned his seat to either of these, but they would not hear of it. A gentle altercation ensued between the parson and the solicitor as to which should ride on the box. The lawyer desired to yield the place to the cloth, but the parson would not hear of this. The silver hairs of the other claimed precedence. The stockbroker mounted to the roof of the fly, and the clerical gentleman hung on behind. The hero professed his readiness to walk. Eventually the cab drew up at Mrs. Baker's door. That stout, elderly lady received her old lodger without effusion and with languid interest. The look of the house was not what it had been. It had deteriorated. The windows had not been cleaned, nor the banisters dusted. "My dear old landlady, I am so glad to see you again," said Joseph. "Thank you, sir. You ordered no meal, but I have got 2 mutton chops in the larder and can mash some potatoes. At what time would you like your supper, sir?" She had become a machine, a thing of routine. "Not yet, thank you. I have business to transact first, and I shall not be disengaged before 9 o'clock. But I have something to say to you, Mrs. Baker, and I will say it at once and get it over, if you will kindly step up into my parlour." She did so, sighing at each step of the stairs as she ascended. All the characters mounted as well, and entering the little sitting-room, ranged themselves against the wall facing the door. Mrs. Baker was a portly woman, aged about 45, and plain-featured. She had formerly been neat, now she was dowdy. Before she had lost her character, she never appeared in that room without removing her apron, but on this occasion she wore it, and it was not clean. "Widow," said Joseph, addressing his character, "will you kindly step forward? I would do anything for with a roll of the eyes." "Dear Mrs. Baker," said Leveridge, I feel that I have done you a grievous wrong. Well, sir, I ain't been myself since you put me into your book. My purpose is now to undo the past, and to provide you with a character." Then, turning to the skittish widow of his creation, he said, "Now then, slip in to an occupier." "I don't like the tenement," said the widow, pouting. "Whether you like it or not," protested Joseph, "you must have that or no other." He waved his hand. "Presto!" he exclaimed. Instantly a wondrous change was effected in Mrs. Baker. She whipped off the apron and crammed it under the sofa cushion. She wriggled in her movements. She eyed herself in the glass and exclaimed, "Oh my, what a fright I am! I'll be back again in a minute when I have changed my gown and done up my hair." "We can dispense with your presence, Mrs. Baker," said Leverage sternly. "I will ring for you when you are wanted." At that moment, a rap at the door was heard, and Mrs. Baker, having first dropped a coquettish curtsy to her lodger, tripped downstairs to admit the vicar, and to show him up to Mr. Leverage's apartment. "You may go, Mrs. Baker," said he, for she seemed inclined to linger. When she had left the room, Joseph contemplated the reverend gentleman. He bore a crestfallen appearance. He looked as if he had been out in the rain all night without a paletot. His cheeks were flabby, his mouth drooped at the corners, his eyes were vacant, and his whiskers no longer stuck out harassant and assertive. "Dear Vicar," said Leverage, "I cannot forgive myself." In former times, Mr. Leverage would not have dreamed of addressing the reverend gentleman in this familiar manner. But it was other now that the latter looked so limp and forlorn. "My dear Vicar, I cannot forgive myself for the trouble I have brought upon you. It has weighed on me as a nightmare, for I know that it is not you only who have suffered, but also the whole parish of Swanton. Happily a remedy is at hand. I have here," he waved to the parson of his creation, "I have here an individuality I can give to you, and henceforth, if you will not be precisely yourself again, you will be a personality in your parish and the diocese." He waved his hand. Presto! In the twinkling of an eye all was changed in the Vicar of Swanton. He straightened himself. His expression altered to what it never had been before. The cheeks became firm, and lines formed about the mouth indicative of force of character and of self-restraint. The eye assumed an eager look as into far distances, as seeking something beyond the horizon. The vicar walked to the mirror over the mantel-shelf. "Bless me," he said, "I must go to the barber's and have these whiskers off." And he hurried downstairs. After a little pause in the proceedings, Mrs. Baker, now very trim, with a blue ribbon round her neck hanging down in streamers behind, ushered up Mr. Stork. The lawyer had a faded appearance, as if he had been exposed to too strong sunlight. He walked in with an air of lack of interest, and sank into a chair. "My dear old master," said Leverage, "it is my purpose to restore to you all your former energy, and to supply you with what you may possibly have lacked previously." He signed to the white-haired family solicitor he had called into fictitious being, and waved his hand. At once Mr. Stork stood up and shook his legs, as though shaking out crumbs from his trousers. His breast swelled, he threw back his head, his eye shone clear and was steady. "Mr. Leverage," said he, "I have long had my eye on you, sir, had my eye on you. I have marked your character as one of uncompromising probity. I hate shiftiness. I abhor duplicity. I have been disappointed with my clerks. I could not always trust them to do the right thing. I want to strengthen and brace my firm. But I will not take into partnership with myself any but one of the strictest integrity. Sir, I have marked you. I have marked you, Mr. Leverage. Call on me tomorrow morning, and we will consider the preliminaries for a partnership. Don't talk to me of buying a partnership. I have not done so, sir. I know you have not. I will take you in, sir, for your intrinsic value. An honest man is worth his weight in gold, and is as scarce as the precious metal. Then, with dignity, Mr. Stork withdrew, and passed Mr. Box the grocer, mounting the stairs. "Well, Mr. Box," said Leverage, "how wags the world with you?" "Badly, sir, badly since you booked me. I mentioned to you, sir, that I trusted my little business would for a while go on by its own momentum. It has, sir, it has. But the momentum has been downhill. I can't control it. I have not the personality to do so, to serve as a drag, to urge it upwards. I am in daily expectation, sir, of a regular smash-up." "I am sorry to hear this," said Leverage, "but I think I have found a means of putting all to rights. Presto!" He waved his hand, and the imaginary character of the stockbroker had actualized himself in the body of Mr. Box. "I see how to do it. By ginger I do," exclaimed the grocer, a spark coming into his eye. "I'll run my little concern on quite other lines. And look ye here, Mr. Leverage, I bet you my bottom dollar that I'll run it to a tremendous success, become a second Lipton, and keep a yacht." As Mr. Box bounced out of the room and proceeded to run downstairs, he ran against and nearly knocked over Mrs. Baker. The lady was whispering to and coquetting with Mr. Wotherspoon, who was on the landing. That gentleman, in his condition of lack of individuality, was like a teetotum spun in the hands of the designing Mrs. Baker, who put forth all the witchery she possessed, or supposed that she possessed, to entangle him in an amorous intrigue. "Come in," shouted Joseph Leverage, and Mr. Wotherspoon, looking hot and frightened and very shy, tottered in and sank into a chair. He was too much shaken and perturbed by the advances of Mrs. Baker to be able to speak. "There," said Joseph, addressing his hero, "you cannot do better than animate that feeble creature. Go!" Instantly Mr. Wotherspoon sprang to his feet. "By George," said he, "I wonder that never struck me before. I'll at once volunteer to go out to South Africa and have a shot at those canting, lying, treacherous Boers. If I come back with a score of their scalps at my waist, I shall have deserved well of my country. I will volunteer at once. But I say, Leverage, clear that hulking, fat old landlady out of the way. She blocks the stairs, and I can't kick down a woman." When Mr. Wotherspoon was gone, "Well," said Poppy, "what have you got for me?" "If you will come with me, Poppy dear, I will serve you as well as the rest. I hope better than you did that odious little widow. But she is well paid out." "Follow me to the riverside," said Joseph. "At 8:03 p.m. I am due there, and so is another, a lady. And pray, why did you not make her come here instead of lugging me all the way down there?" "Because I could not make an appointment with a young lady in my bachelor's apartments." "That's all very fine, but I am there." "Yes, but you are only an imaginary character, and she is a substantial reality." "I think I had better accompany you," said Lady Mabel. "I think not. If your ladyship will kindly occupy my fauteuil till I return, that chair will ever after be sacred to me. Come along, Poppy." "I'm game," said she. On reaching the riverside, Joseph saw that Miss Vincent was walking there in a listless manner, not straight, but swerving from side to side. She saw him, but did not quicken her pace, nor did her face light up with interest. "Now then," said he to Poppy, "what do you think of her?" "She ain't bad," answered the fictitious character. "She is very pretty, certainly, but inanimate. You will change all that." "I'll try, you bet." Asphodel came up. She bowed, but did not extend her hand. "Miss Vincent," said Joseph, "how good of you to come." "Not at all. I could not help. I have no free will left. When you wrote, 'Come, I came,' I could do no other. I have no initiative, no power of resistance." "I do hope, Miss Vincent, that the thing you so feared has not happened." "What thing?" "You have not been snapped up by a fortune hunter?" "No. People have not as yet found out that I have lost my individuality. I have kept very much to myself, that is to say, not to myself, as I have no proper myself left. I mean to the semblance of myself. People have thought I was anemic." Leverage turned aside. "Well, Poppy, right you are." Leverage waved his hand. Instantly all the inertia passed away from the girl. She stood erect and firm. A merry twinkle kindled in her eye, a flush was on her cheek, and mischievous devilry played about her lips. "I feel," said she, "as another person." "Oh, I am so glad, Miss Vincent. That is a pretty speech to make to a lady. Glad I am different from what I was before. I did not mean that. I meant that as you were and as you are always charming." "Thank you, sir," said Asphodel, curtsying and laughing. "Ah, Miss Vincent, at all times you have seemed to me the ideal of womanhood. I have worshipped the very ground you have trod upon." "Fiddlesticks." He looked at her. For the moment he was bewildered. oblivious that the old personality of Asphodel had passed into his book, and that the new personality of Poppy had invaded Asphodel. "Well," said she, "is that all you have to say to me?" "All? Oh, no. I could say a great deal. I have ordered my supper for 9 o'clock. Oh, how obtuse you men are. Come, is this leap year? I really believe that it is. Then I shall take the privilege of the year, and offer you my hand and heart and fortune there. Now it only remains with you to name the day." "Oh, Miss Vincent, you overcome me." "Stuff and nonsense. Call me Asphodel, do Joe." Mr. Leveridge walked back to his lodgings as if he trod on air. As he passed by the churchyard, he noticed the vicar, now shaven and shorn, labouring at a laden wheelbarrow. He halted at the rails and said, "Why, vicar, what are you about?" "The sexton has begun a grave for old Betty Goodman, and it is unfinished. He must dig another." He turned over the wheelbarrow and shot its contents into the grave. "But what are you doing?" again asked Joseph. "Burying the mitre hymnals," replied the vicar. The clock struck 9:15. "I must hurry," exclaimed Joseph. On reaching his lodgings, he found Major Dolgelly Jones in his sitting room, sitting on the edge of his table tossing up a tennis ball. In the armchair, invisible to the Major, reclined Lady Mabel. "I am so sorry to be late," apologized Joseph. "How are you, sir?" "Below par. I have been so ever since you put me into your book. I have no appetite for golf. I can do nothing to pass the weary hours but toss up and down a tennis ball." "I hope," began Joseph, and then a horror seized on him. He had no personality of his creation left but that of Lady Mabel. Would it be possible to translate that into the Major? He remained silent, musing for a while, and then said hesitatingly to the lady, "Here, my lady, is the body you are to individualize, but it is that of a man. There is no other left. It is hardly delicate. There is no help for it." Then turning to the Major, he said, "I am very sorry. It really is no fault of mine, but I have only a female personality to offer to you, and that elderly." "It is all one to me," replied the Major. Catchy caught the ball. "Many of our generals are old women. I am agreeable. Placeorks dames." "But," protested Lady Mabel, "you made me a member of a very ancient titled house that came over with the Conqueror. The personality I offer you," said I to the Major. "Though female is noble, the family is named in the roll of Battle Abbey." "Oh," said Dolgelly Jones, "I descend from one of the royal families of Powys, lineally from Caswallon Lanhir and Maelgwn Gwynedd, long before the Conqueror was thought of." "Well then," said Leveridge, and waved his hand. "In Swanton, it is known that the Major now never plays golf. He keeps rabbits. It is with some scruple that I insert this record in the Book of Ghosts, for actually it is not a story of ghosts. But a greater scruple moved me as to whether I should be justified in revealing a professional secret, known only among such as belong to the confraternity of writers of fiction. But I have observed so much perplexity arise, so much friction caused, by persons suddenly breaking out into a course of conduct or into actions, so entirely inconsistent with their former conduct, as to stagger their acquaintances and friends. Henceforth, to use a vulgarism, since I have let the cat out of the bag, they will know that such persons have been used up by novel writers that have known them, and who have replaced the stolen individualities with others freshly created. This is the explanation, and the explanation has up to the present remained a professional secret. Chapter 8. H.P. The river Vézère leaps to life among the granite of the Limousine, forms a fine cascade, the Saut de la Virole. Then after a rapid descent over mica schist, it passes into the region of red sandstone at Brive, and swelled with affluence it suddenly penetrates a chalk district, where it has scooped out for itself a valley between precipices some 200 to 300 feet high. These precipices are not perpendicular but overhang, because the upper crust is harder than the stone it caps, and atmospheric influences, rain and frost, have gnawed into the chalk below, so that the cliffs hang forward as penthouse roofs, forming shelters beneath them. And these shelters have been utilized by man from the period when the first occupants of the district arrived at a vastly remote period, almost uninterruptedly to the present day. When peasants live beneath these roofs of nature's providing, they simply wall up the face and ends to form houses of the cheapest description of construction, with the earth as the floor, and one wall and the roof of living rock, into which they burrow to form cupboards, bed places and cellars. The refuse of all ages is superposed, like the leaves of a book, one stratum above another in orderly succession. If we shear down through these beds, we can read the history of the land, so far as its manufacture goes, beginning at the present day and going down to the times of primeval man. Now, after every meal, the peasant casts down the bones he has picked. He does not stoop to collect and cast forth the sherds of a broken pot, and if a sou falls and rolls away, in the dust of these gloomy habitations it gets trampled into the soil to form another token of the period of occupation. When the first man settled here, the climatic conditions were different. The mammoth or woolly elephant, the hyena, the cave bear, and the reindeer ranged the land. Then naked savages, using only flint tools, crouched under these rocks. They knew nothing of metals and of pottery. They hunted and ate the horse. They had no dogs, no oxen, no sheep. Glaciers covered the center of France and reached down the Vézère Valley as far as to Brive. These people passed away, whither we know not. The reindeer retreated to the north, the hyena to Africa, which was then united to Europe. The mammoth became extinct altogether. After long ages, another people, in a higher condition of culture, but who also used flint tools and weapons, appeared on the scene and took possession of the abandoned rock shelters. They fashioned their implements in a different manner, by flaking the flint in place of chipping it. They understood the art of the potter. They grew flax and wove linen. They had domestic animals, and the dog had become the friend of man, and their flint weapons they succeeded in bringing to a high polish by incredible labor and perseverance. Then came in the age of bronze, introduced from abroad, probably from the east, as its great depot was in the basin of the Po. Next arrived the Gauls, armed with weapons of iron. They were subjugated by the Romans, and Roman Gaul in turn became a prey to the Goth and the Frank. History has begun and is in full swing. The medieval period succeeded, and finally the modern age, and man now lives on top of the accumulation of all preceding epochs of men and stages of civilization. In no other part of France, indeed of Europe, is the story of man told so plainly that he who runs may read. And ever since the middle of last century, when this fact was recognized, the district has been studied, and explorations have been made there, some slovenly, others scientifically. A few years ago, I was induced to visit this remarkable region and to examine it attentively. I had been furnished with letters of recommendation from the authorities of the Great Museum of National Antiquities at Saint-Germain to enable me to prosecute my researches unmolested by over-suspicious gendarmes and ignorant mayors. Under one overhanging rock was a cabaret or tavern, announcing that wine was sold there by a withered bush above the door. The place seemed to me to be a probable spot for my exploration. I entered into an arrangement with the proprietor to enable me to dig, he stipulating that I should not undermine and throw down his walls. I engaged 6 laborers and began proceedings by driving a tunnel some little way below the tavern into the vast bed of debris. The upper series of deposits did not concern me much. The point I desired to investigate, and if possible to determine, was the approximate length of time that had elapsed between the disappearance of the reindeer hunters and the coming on the scene of the next race, that which used polished stone implements and had domestic animals. Although it may seem at first sight as if both races had been savage, as both lived in the Stone Age, yet an enormous stride forward had been taken when men had learned the arts of weaving, of pottery, and had tamed the dog, the horse, and the cow. These new folk had passed out of the mere wild condition of the hunter, and had become pastoral and to some extent agricultural. Of course, the data for determining the length of a period might be few, but I could judge whether a very long or a very brief period had elapsed between the two occupations by the depth of debris chalk fallen from the roof, brought down by frost, in which were no traces of human workmanship. It was with this distinct object in view that I drove my adit into the slope of rubbish some way below the cabaret and I chanced to have hit on the level of the deposits of the men of bronze. Not that we found much bronze. All we secured was a broken pin, but we came on fragments of pottery marked with the chevron and nail and twisted thong ornament peculiar to that people and age. My men were engaged for about a week before we reached the face of the chalk cliff. We found the work not so easy as I had anticipated. Masses of rock had become detached from above and had fallen, so that we had either to quarry through them or to circumvent them. The soil was of that curious coffee color so inseparable from the chalk formation. We found many things brought down from above, a coin commemorative of the storming of the Bastille, and some small pieces of the later Roman emperors. But all of these were, of course, not in the solid ground below, but near the surface. When we had reached the face of the cliff, instead of sinking a shaft, I determined on carrying a gallery down an incline, keeping the rock as a wall on my right, till I reached the bottom of all. The advantage of making an incline was that there was no hauling up of the earth by a bucket let down over a pulley, and it was easier for myself to descend. I had not made my tunnel wide enough, and it was tortuous. When I began to sink, I set 2 of the men to smash up the masses of fallen chalk rock so as to widen the tunnel so that I might use barrows. I gave strict orders that all the material brought up was to be picked over by 2 of the most intelligent of the men, outside in the blaze of the sun. I was not desirous of sinking too expeditiously. I wished to proceed slowly, cautiously, observing every stage as we went deeper. We got below the layer in which were the relics of the Bronze Age and of the men of polished stone, and then we passed through many feet of earth that rendered nothing, and finally came on the traces of the reindeer period. To understand how that there should be a considerable depth of the debris of the men of the rude stone implements, it must be explained that these men made their hearths on the bare ground and feasted around their fires, throwing about them the bones they had picked, and the ashes, and broken and disused implements, till the ground was inconveniently encumbered. Then they swept all the refuse together over their old hearth, and established another on top. So the process went on from generation to generation. For the scientific results of my exploration, I must refer the reader to the journals and memoirs of learned societies. I will not trouble him with them here. On the 9th day after we had come to the face of the cliff, and when we had reached a considerable depth, we uncovered some human bones. I immediately adopted special precautions, so that these should not be disturbed. With the utmost care, the soil was removed from over them, and it took us half a day to completely clear a perfect skeleton. It was that of a full-grown man, lying on his back, with the skull supported against the wall of chalk rock. He did not seem to have been buried. Had he been so, he would doubtless have been laid on his side in a contracted posture, with the chin resting on the knees. One of the men pointed out to me that a mass of fallen rock lay beyond his feet, and had apparently shut him in, so that he had died through suffocation, buried under the earth that the rock had brought down with it. I at once dispatched a man to my hotel to fetch my camera, that I might by flashlight take a photograph of the skeleton as it lay, and another I sent to get from the chemist and grocer as much gum arabic and isinglass as could be procured. My object was to give to the bones a bath of gum to render them less brittle when removed, restoring to them the gelatine that had been absorbed by the earth and lime in which they lay. Thus I was left alone at the bottom of my passage, the 4 men above being engaged in straightening the adit and sifting the earth. I was quite content to be alone, so that I might at my ease search for traces of personal ornament worn by the man who had thus met his death. The place was somewhat cramped, and there really was not room in it for more than 1 person to work freely. Whilst I was thus engaged, I suddenly heard a shout, followed by a crash, and to my dismay, an avalanche of rubble shot down the inclined passage of descent. I at once left the skeleton, and hastened to effect my exit, but found that this was impossible. Much of the superincumbent earth and stone had fallen, dislodged by the vibrations caused by the picks of the men smashing up the chalk blocks, and the passage was completely choked. I was sealed up in the hollow where I was, and thankful that the earth above me had not fallen as well, and buried me, a man of the present enlightened age, along with the primeval savage of 8,000 years ago. A large amount of matter must have fallen, for I could not hear the voices of the men. I was not seriously alarmed. The workmen would procure assistance and labor indefatigably to release me. Of that I could be certain. But how much earth had fallen? How much of the passage was choked? And how long would they take before I was released? All that was uncertain. I had a candle, or rather, a bit of one, and it was not probable that it would last till the passage was cleared. What made me most anxious was the question whether the supply of air in the hollow in which I was enclosed would suffice. My enthusiasm for prehistoric research failed me just then. All my interests were concentrated on the present, and I gave up groping about the skeleton for relics. I seated myself on a stone, set the candle in a socket of chalk I had scooped out with my pocket knife, and awaited events with my eyes on the skeleton. Time passed somewhat wearily. I could hear an occasional thud, thud, when the men were using the pick, but they mostly employed the shovel, as I supposed. I set my elbows on my knees and rested my chin in my hands. The air was not cold, nor was the soil damp. It was dry as snuff. The flicker of my light played over the man of bones, and especially illumined the skull. It may have been fancy on my part, it probably was fancy, but it seemed to me as though something sparkled in the eye sockets. Drops of water possibly lodged there, or crystals formed within the skull, but the effect was much as of eyes leering and winking at me. I lighted my pipe, and to my disgust found that my supply of matches was running short. In France, the manufacture belongs to the state, and one gets but 60 allumettes for a penny. I had not brought my watch with me below ground, fearing lest it might meet with an accident. Consequently, I was unable to reckon how time passed. I began counting and ticking off the minutes on my fingers, but soon tired of doing this. My candle was getting short, it would not last much longer, and then I should be in the dark. I consoled myself with the thought that with the extinction of the light, the consumption of the oxygen in the air would be less rapid. My eyes now rested on the flame of the candle, and I watched the gradual diminution of the composite. It was one of those abominable bougies with holes in them to economize the wax, and which consequently had less than the proper amount of material for feeding and maintaining a flame. At length the light went out, and I was left in total darkness. I might have used up the rest of my matches, one after another, but to what good? They would prolong the period of illumination for but a very little while. A sense of numbness stole over me, but I was not as yet sensible of deficiency of air to breathe. I found that the stone on which I was seated was pointed and hard, but I did not like to shift my position for fear of getting among and disturbing the bones, and I was still desirous of having them photographed in situ before they were moved. I was not alarmed at my situation. I knew that I must be released eventually, but the tedium of sitting there in the dark and on a pointed stone was becoming intolerable. Some time must have elapsed before I became, dimly at first, and then distinctly, aware of a bluish phosphorescent emanation from the skeleton. This seemed to rise above it like a faint smoke, which gradually gained consistency, took form, and became distinct, and I saw before me the misty, luminous form of a naked man, with wolfish countenance, prognathous jaws, glaring at me out of eyes deeply sunk under projecting brows. Although I thus described what I saw, yet it gave me no idea of substance. It was vaporous, and yet it was articulate. Indeed, I cannot say at this moment whether I actually saw this apparition with my eyes, or whether it was a dreamlike vision of the brain. Though luminous, it cast no light on the walls of the cave. If I raised my hand, it did not obscure any portion of the form presented to me. Then I heard, "I will tear you with the nails of my fingers and toes and rip you with my teeth." "What have I done to injure and incense you?" I asked. And here I must explain. No word was uttered by either of us. No word could have been uttered by this vaporous form. It had no material lungs,